In 1947, if you wanted to build a car in Sweden, there was an obvious way to do it. You started small, you built a simple frame, put a modest engine in it, and worked your way up as your factory and your engineers learned the trade through years of trial and error. That was how Volvo had done it. Slowly, methodically, learning the automotive business from the ground floor up. That was how nearly every automaker on Earth had done it. Cars were built by car companies, staffed by people who had spent their entire careers thinking about wheels, suspensions, gearboxes, and engines built specifically for the demands of the road. Nobody built a car by first spending a decade building fighter jets. Nobody handed a from-scratch automotive project to aeronautical engineers who had never designed a road vehicle in their lives, and simply told them to start with a blank sheet of paper, armed with nothing but what they already understood about airflow, structural rigidity, and airframe construction. Saab did exactly that, and the decision would define the company for the next 70 years in ways nobody at the time could have predicted. It remains one of the strangest origin stories in the entire history of the automobile. An industry not exactly short on strange origin stories, and it began not with any passion for cars whatsoever, but with a factory that suddenly had nothing left to build. Most car companies exist because someone loved cars first, and figured out the engineering second. Saab ran the sequence in reverse, and the reversal is the entire reason its cars ended up looking and driving like nothing else on the market. The company was not born to build cars, it was born to build airplanes, and it was born directly out of fear. In 1937, with war clouds gathering over Europe and Sweden, determined to remain armed, self-sufficient, and neutral, the Swedish government created Svenska Aeroplan AB, the Swedish aeroplane company, abbreviated Saab, in the small industrial city of Trollhättan. Its founding purpose was singular: build military aircraft for the Swedish Air Force, because a neutral nation surrounded on all sides by belligerent powers could not afford to depend on foreign suppliers for the warplanes that guaranteed its independence. Within just a few years, Saab was producing fighters and bombers of genuinely advanced design, aircraft that held their own in performance against machines built by nations with vastly larger industrial economies and far deeper aviation traditions stretching back decades. By the time the Second World War ended in 1945, Saab possessed something rare and valuable: a workforce of engineers fluent in aerodynamics, lightweight structural design, and precision manufacturing, working inside a sprawling factory built for producing flying machines rather than automobiles of any kind whatsoever. The aircraft Saab produced during those years, machines like the B-17 dive bomber and the J-21 fighter, were not derivative copies of foreign designs licensed cheaply from abroad. They were original engineering solutions to Sweden's very particular strategic problem: a small population, a limited industrial base, and an absolute requirement for self-sufficiency in the air. That same requirement, building something world-class with resources a fraction of what larger nations could throw at the problem, would resurface almost identically a decade later, except by then, the subject would be sedans instead of bombers. Then the war ended, and almost overnight, the Swedish Air Force needed dramatically fewer new aircraft. Saab's leadership faced an uncomfortable arithmetic problem that threatened the company's entire existence going forward. A company built and staffed for wartime aircraft production at volume now had thousands of highly skilled workers and an enormous manufacturing complex, with nowhere near enough aviation orders remaining to keep either one occupied. Diversification was not a strategic option to be weighed at leisure over quarterly board meetings. It was survival, plain and immediate and urgent. The company's directors debated a range of possibilities: buses, refrigerators, prefabricated housing units, even ordinary kitchen appliances. Eventually, someone inside the organization floated an idea that struck many colleagues as almost absurd on its face: build a car. Not because anyone at Saab possessed automotive experience of any kind. Nobody did. Not the engineers, not the factory foreman, not the executives signing off on the project with visible reluctance, but because Sweden's roads were steadily filling with vehicles, the post-war economy was hungry for affordable and reliable personal transportation, and the company had a factory full of people who already knew how to solve extraordinarily difficult engineering problems, even one this unfamiliar. There was also a simpler calculation at work beneath the surface. Sweden had almost no domestic automobile industry of its own to speak of, which meant a company willing to take the financial risk faced remarkably little established competition on home soil, whatever the odds looked like from an engineering standpoint. The board's real gamble was not really about whether a car could be built at all. It was about whether an aircraft company's engineering culture could survive the translation into an entirely different product without losing whatever had made it exceptional in the first place. The man who ended up shaping that first car was not, strictly speaking, an automotive man at all. His name was Gunnar Ljungstrom, and before the war effort redirected his career entirely, he had trained formally as an aeronautical engineer. He had spent years of his professional life thinking about how to make an airframe strong without making it heavy, how to shape a fuselage so the air slid over its surface with the absolute minimum of resistance, and how every unnecessary gram of structure translated directly into wasted fuel and diminished performance thousands of feet in the air. When Saab assembled a small internal team to sketch what an automobile designed by an aircraft company might actually look like, Ljungstrom and his colleagues did not begin by studying the sedans their future competitors were already selling in showrooms across Europe. They began, instead, by asking the exact same question they had spent years asking about wings and tail sections. What shape moves through air with the least possible resistance? And how do we construct that shape while keeping it as light and as structurally sound as we can possibly manage? The answer they arrived at looked almost nothing like a conventional automobile of the era. Ljungstrom reportedly kept a small model aircraft on his desk throughout the design process, a physical reminder of the discipline he was determined to import wholesale into a completely different industry, whether or not the rest of the automotive world understood or approved of the approach. Colleagues later recalled him rejecting early sketches simply because they looked too much like existing cars, a standard almost nobody else in the industry would have thought to apply. The prototype, internally designated Project 92, emerged from the Trollhättan works in 1946, looking like nothing else on Swedish roads, or arguably on any road anywhere in Europe at the time. It was shaped like a teardrop, almost egg-like in profile, with a steeply raked windshield and a body that curved and tapered the way an aircraft fuselage curves and tapers toward its tail section, because that was precisely the design lineage from which it descended directly. Skeptics inside the company worried openly that the shape looked too strange, too aeronautical, too much like something that belonged in the open sky rather than parked outside a Stockholm apartment building on an ordinary weekday. But the underlying aerodynamic logic was sound, and wind tunnel testing, along with extensive road testing, confirmed it repeatedly over many months. When the production version, the Saab 92, finally launched to the public in 1949, its drag coefficient was startlingly low for the period, low enough that a small two-cylinder, two-stroke engine producing barely 25 horsepower could move the car at a genuinely respectable clip while sipping fuel with impressive efficiency for its class. It was front-wheel drive at a time when that layout remained highly unusual in mainstream automobiles, chosen deliberately because it improved weight distribution and traction, the same underlying obsession with efficient mass distribution that had governed how Saab's aircraft were balanced for stable, controllable flight. Even the door hinges and the window seals carried a faint echo of aviation practice, sealed tightly enough to reduce wind noise at speed, in a way ordinary economy cars of the period rarely bothered to address. None of it was expensive to include at the design stage. It simply required engineers who instinctively noticed problems that automotive trained designers had long since learned to overlook as unavoidable. The 92 was not fast by any conventional measure of the era. It was not glamorous, and nobody mistook it for a luxury vehicle sitting in a dealer's window. But it handled with a precision and a planted stability that heavier, more conventionally engineered sedans from larger, more established manufacturers consistently struggled to match, because every body panel and every structural member had been designed by people who thought about a vehicle's outer shell the way they thought about an airplane's skin, as an integral, load-bearing structure contributing directly to overall rigidity, not as decorative sheet metal simply bolted onto an independent frame underneath. Swedish buyers, driving through brutally unpredictable winters on roads coated in ice and packed snow for months at a time, discovered something the engineers had not necessarily set out to prove when they first sketched that odd teardrop shape on paper. A car built like an airplane, with a rigid unibody shell and an unusually low center of gravity, handled dramatically better in snow and ice than the traditional body-on-frame sedans everyone else in the industry was building and selling to consumers. Saab had not set out specifically to build a winter car. It had set out to build an aerodynamically efficient one. The extraordinary winter performance turned out to be aerodynamics and structural engineering paying an unplanned but immensely valuable dividend. Word of mouth among rural Swedish drivers, the people who depended on their cars simply starting and holding the road through the darkest months of the year, did more for the 92's early reputation than any advertising campaign the company could have afforded to run. Doctors, postal workers, and rural veterinarians, people whose jobs depended on reaching remote farms, regardless of the weather, became some of the car's most vocal early advocates, long before any rally trophy entered the picture. Word of Saab's strange little car spread slowly at first, and it spread mostly through motorsport, where the company's engineers pursued competitive rallying with exactly the same intensity Saab's aircraft division had once brought to combat aircraft performance during the darkest years of the war. The Saab 92, and later its successors the 93 and the 96, began entering major European rally competitions where the roads were unpaved, the weather was frequently miserable, and the cars that survived to reach the finish line were the ones engineered to endure genuine abuse rather than merely impress prospective buyers standing quietly in a showroom. Against far more powerful and considerably more expensive competitors from Britain, Germany, and Italy, the little Saabs kept finishing near the front of the field, and sometimes they won outright because raw horsepower mattered far less on a rutted, ice-covered mountain pass than structural integrity, low overall weight, and a chassis that simply refused to lose its composure under sustained punishment. Rally driver Eric Carlson became something close to a national folk hero behind the wheel of a Saab, winning major international rallies repeatedly through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, including consecutive victories at the grueling RAC rally in Britain, and in the process, turning the brand's public reputation from that odd egg-shaped economy car from the aircraft company into something considerably more formidable. The small car that kept winning precisely when everyone expected it to break down instead. Carlson's nickname among British rally fans, Eric the Red, followed him across an entire decade of competition, and his victories did more to establish Saab's identity outside Scandinavia than the company's actual sales figures ever managed to do on their own. European motoring journalists who had initially dismissed Saab as a curiosity, an aircraft manufacturer amateurishly dabbling in an industry it fundamentally did not understand, gradually began revising their assumptions once they watched the cars compete directly against established rivals on genuinely equal terms. Many had assumed, without much real scrutiny, that a company possessing no automotive pedigree whatsoever simply could not out-engineer manufacturers with decades of dedicated, specialized automotive experience behind them already. That comfortable assumption held right up until Saab started beating those very manufacturers on the same brutal rally stages, in the same punishing conditions, using two-stroke engines a fraction of the displacement and power of their rivals' engines under the hood. The dismissiveness did not evaporate instantly or gracefully, the way a single dramatic victory in fiction tends to change every mind at once. Some critics continued treating Saab's aircraft heritage as little more than a clever marketing gimmick rather than a genuine and repeatable engineering advantage, right up until the accumulating trophies and podium finishes made the underlying pattern simply impossible to keep ignoring any longer. By the middle of the 1960s, even journalists who had once mocked the car's odd proportions were writing admiringly about its cornering stability, a reversal that mirrored, on a much smaller scale, the way skepticism toward unconventional engineering tends to collapse the moment results become undeniable on the scoreboard. By the 1960s and deep into the 1970s, Saab had become something genuinely unusual within the global automotive landscape. a manufacturer whose cars were instantly identifiable by their engineering eccentricities, and whose owners were fiercely, almost evangelically loyal to the brand and everything it represented. The Saab 99, introduced in 1968, brought turbocharging to a mainstream production car in a way that fundamentally reshaped what ordinary buyers expected from a modest four-cylinder engine, and the later Saab 900 Turbo, launched in 1978, became one of the defining performance cars of its entire era, prized for delivering genuinely thrilling speed without ever abandoning the structural obsessions that had always defined the brand's engineering identity from the very beginning. Saab engineers famously placed the ignition key on the center console rather than on the steering column, a small ergonomic detail traceable directly back to aircraft cockpit design, where a pilot's hands needed to move through deliberate, well rehearsed sequences under genuine pressure. Saab built cars with reinforced passenger cells shaped conceptually like the load bearing structures of an airframe. Cars that performed unusually well in crash testing years before crash safety became a serious marketing priority for the rest of the automotive industry. Owners routinely described the sensation of driving a Saab as something closer to piloting an aircraft than merely driving a car, a claim that sounds like convenient brand mythology until you actually learn who designed the earliest models and why they made the choices they made. Saab even experimented briefly with aircraft-style heads-up displays and cockpit-inspired instrument clusters decades before either concept became fashionable elsewhere in the industry. Small touches that rarely made headlines, but consistently reinforced the sense that a Saab cabin was built by people who thought in three dimensions rather than two. But the same instincts that made Saab's cars so distinctive also made them expensive to manufacture and genuinely difficult to scale profitably across a growing model lineup. Aircraft grade engineering does not come cheap under any circumstances, and a company applying aerospace level tolerances and aerospace derived materials thinking to mass market consumer vehicles was fighting an economic battle that pure automakers, optimized from their very first day for automotive scale manufacturing efficiency, never had to fight at all in the same way. Every reinforced structural pillar, every over-engineered subframe, every small batch turbocharger system that meaningfully outperformed what mainstream manufacturers offered also cost considerably more to produce on an assembly line and considerably more to service once it reached a customer's home garage. Saab's cars earned a durable reputation for being fantastic to drive and genuinely maddening to keep running economically over the long term of ownership. The same aerospace derived engineering DNA that had made the humble 92 handle like nothing else on packed snow, and that had made the 900 Turbo an enduring cult classic decades later among enthusiasts, was quietly straining the balance sheet of a relatively small manufacturer trying to compete against automotive giants, possessing economies of scale that Saab, by its very nature and history, could never realistically match on its own. Independent Saab remained a niche player for its entire existence, selling well under 200,000 vehicles annually at its peak, a volume that left almost no cushion for the kind of costly engineering indulgences the brand had built its entire identity around. General Motors took a minority stake in Saab Automobile in 1990 and acquired full ownership by the year 2000, promising the deep resources of a genuine global automotive giant to finally scale Saab's engineering ambitions into sustained, lasting profitability. For a while, the arrangement seemed entirely plausible, even promising. New models arrived roughly on schedule, platforms were deliberately shared with other GM brands to meaningfully cut development costs across the board, and Saab's distinctive engineering touches were preserved, at least in part, inside a much larger and far more bureaucratic corporate machine than the company had ever known. But sharing platforms with mainstream GM models diluted precisely the aerospace derived engineering distinctiveness that had made Saab worth acquiring in the first place. Loyal owners noticed the change almost immediately, in the way the doors closed and the way the chassis responded on a rough road. Automotive critics noticed it too, in road test after road test. The cars that emerged through the 2000s still drove reasonably well by ordinary standards, but they no longer felt like they had been designed by people who used to build fighter jets for a living. They felt, increasingly, like rebadged Opals and Saturns, wearing a Saab emblem for the sake of appearances, and sales, rather than climbing steadily with GM's considerable backing, began a long, grinding, and ultimately irreversible decline throughout the following decade. Engineers who had joined the company specifically because of its aerospace-derived reputation for doing things differently found themselves instead sitting in meetings about badge placement and shared bumper tooling, a demoralizing shift that several later described in interviews as the moment the old Saab, the one descended directly from Trollhättan's aircraft hangars, effectively stopped existing in spirit, if not yet in name. The 2008 global financial crisis hit the auto industry with brutal, indiscriminate force, sparing almost nobody in its path. General Motors, drowning in catastrophic losses of its own and forced into a government assisted bankruptcy back home in the United States, could no longer justify propping up a chronically unprofitable Swedish subsidiary an ocean away from Detroit. GM formally announced in 2009 that it would wind down or sell Saab entirely, with no further investment forthcoming. A Dutch specialty manufacturer, Spyker Cars, purchased the company in early 2010, promising a genuine revival built on renewed investment and restored engineering independence for the brand. The rescue lasted barely a year and a half before collapsing under its own financial weight. Saab Automobile filed for bankruptcy in December 2011, and its Trollhättan factory, the very site where those aircraft-inspired, egg-shaped prototypes had first rolled out onto Swedish roads more than 6 decades earlier, fell completely and permanently. Silent. Thousands of workers who had spent entire careers building cars, descended conceptually from fighter jet engineering, lost their jobs virtually overnight, with little warning. The brand that had once beaten seasoned, established automakers on their own rally stages, using tiny two-stroke engines against far larger rivals, was gone from dealership showrooms within a matter of mere months. Production at Trollhättan, which had run in some form since the very first Project 92 prototype rolled through the gates in 1946, simply stopped, and for a period the factory sat largely empty, a monument to 65 years of automotive engineering with no cars left to build inside it. But the larger story does not actually end in that grim bankruptcy filing, because Saab, understood properly and in full, had never been merely a car manufacturer to begin with. Saab Automobile was always a subsidiary, a single branch grown off a considerably older and far sturdier trunk. The original Svenska Aeroplan AB, the aerospace and defense company that had been building fighter jets continuously since 1937 without interruption, had deliberately spun off its automotive division as a fully independent entity back in 1990. Precisely so, the core aerospace business could continue pursuing lucrative military and civilian aviation contracts without being financially entangled to the automotive division's far more uncertain fortunes. That original aerospace company survived the car brand's very public collapse, completely intact, largely untouched by the turmoil, because it had simply never stopped doing what it was founded to do more than 70 years earlier. While showrooms bearing the Saab name went permanently dark across Europe and beyond, engineers at the company's facilities in Linköping were still busy designing the Gripen, a lightweight, remarkably agile multi-role fighter jet that other nations' air forces were actively purchasing in growing numbers year after year, still building sophisticated radar systems, and still manufacturing precision components destined for the global space industry. The overlap between the two Saabs, the vanished car company, and the thriving defense contractor, was so thin by the time of the bankruptcy that many casual observers assumed they were watching an entire corporate empire collapse, when in reality only a single, chronically underfunded branch had actually fallen. Saab AB, the aerospace and defense company, is today one of the most successful defense contractors headquartered anywhere outside the United States, supplying advanced fighter aircraft, submarines, missile systems, and radar technology to militaries scattered clear across the globe, including several NATO member states and a range of neutral nations actively seeking a credible alternative to American and Russian suppliers alike. The Gripen fighter jet, the direct engineering descendant of the very same design culture that once produced the wartime aircraft, funding the company's first tentative automotive experiment back in the 1940s, remains one of the most cost-effective and genuinely combat-capable fighter platforms flying anywhere in the world today. purchased and operated by air forces across South America, Europe, and Southeast Asia alike. Brazil selected the Gripen over rival American and French designs in a landmark 2013 competition, a decision Brazilian officials cited as being driven substantially by the aircraft's low operating cost relative to its performance, precisely the kind of efficiency per gram calculation that had defined Saab's engineering culture from its very first aircraft in 1937 onward. The company that had, almost accidentally, created one of the most beloved and eccentric car brands of the entire 20th century as a post war diversification scheme never actually needed that car brand to survive at all in the end. It only needed the brand to prove, once, decisively and unambiguously, that engineers trained to build machines that fly could also build machines that merely needed to grip a road. The individual engineers who first shaped that strange, teardrop shaped Saab 92 back in 1946 mostly lived long enough to witness the brand's full and complete arc. Its rally triumphs of the 1950s and the 1960s, its celebrated turbocharged golden years through the 1970s and the 1980s, and its eventual painful commercial collapse in December of 2011. Gunnar Ljungström continued working in Swedish automotive and broader industrial engineering for decades afterward, remembered fondly by Saab historians and devoted enthusiasts as the man who treated a car's outer body the way an aircraft engineer treats a fuselage, and who, in doing so, accidentally invented an entire school of automotive design built around aerodynamic efficiency, structural rigidity, and a stubborn, almost willful refusal to think about cars the way the rest of the industry insisted they absolutely had to be built. Saab loyalists today, organized in dedicated owners' clubs scattered across Europe and North America, still lovingly restore and drive decades-old 900 turbos and even older, humbler 96s, treating each surviving car less like ordinary daily transportation and more like a rolling artifact of a genuinely singular engineering philosophy. One that could only have emerged from a company that started out building fighter planes for a small nation determined never to depend on anyone else for its own national defense. Ljungström died in 1998, 13 years before the automotive brand he had helped invent finally went bankrupt, and by most accounts, he never fully abandoned the belief that a car, properly conceived, deserved exactly the same rigor an aircraft demanded. In the years since Saab Automobile's bankruptcy, a Chinese-backed company called NEVS, National Electric Vehicle Sweden, acquired the Trollhättan factory along with some of Saab's remaining automotive assets and intellectual property, attempting to revive certain elements of the brand for electric vehicle production aimed largely at export markets in Asia. The beloved gasoline-powered and turbocharged Saabs of the 20th century, however, never returned to production in anything resembling their original form or character. And the Neves venture itself struggled through years of limited output, shifting ownership structures, and repeated production halts. The three-crown badge that once adorned egg-shaped economy cars, competing directly against automakers 100 times its size, now survives mostly in enthusiast garages, in rally archives and museum collections scattered across Scandinavia, and in the ongoing institutional memory of an aerospace company that continues, quietly and consistently and profitably, to build some of the most advanced fighter jets flying anywhere on Earth today. Occasional revival rumors still surface every few years, floated by investors hoping to resurrect the badge on some new platform, but none has yet produced anything resembling the cars that made the name famous in the first place. The lesson embedded in Saab's long, strange story is not simply that aircraft engineers automatically make good automotive engineers, because they plainly do not, at least not automatically. Plenty of other aerospace to automotive experiments throughout industrial history produced nothing but expensive, largely forgettable failures that never found an audience. The real lesson is narrower and considerably stranger than that. A specific set of obsessions about weight, about airflow, about structural integrity under real-world stress, about treating every single component as something that must justify its own existence on the vehicle, can transfer across entirely different industries in ways nobody originally planned for or expected, and can produce something genuinely superior precisely because the people building it did not know or simply did not care how things were conventionally supposed to be done in that industry. Saab's cars were commercially fragile, in the end, because that same uncompromising engineering culture was inherently expensive to scale inside an industry built fundamentally around mass production rather than aerospace grade precision and small batch craftsmanship. The company's triumph and its eventual commercial defeat were produced ultimately by exactly the same underlying instinct, carried faithfully across 7 decades and two completely different industries. Build it as though it absolutely has to fly, even when, in the end, it only ever has to drive.